Welcome. Before you can design a behavior change program or interpret a graph, you must understand what makes this science distinct. This video breaks down the 7 core dimensions of applied behavior analysis, the very criteria that separate true ABA from other approaches. We will also cover how these dimensions connect to your exam blueprint, including task distribution across domains, the difference between applied and basic research, the 4 branches of behavior analysis, and the flow from philosophy to practice. Why does this matter for the BCBA exam? Because questions on the philosophical foundations and concepts and principles domains, worth nearly 20% of your total score, directly test your ability to identify whether an intervention is truly applied, behavioral, analytic, technological, conceptually systematic, effective, and generalizable. Mastering these dimensions gives you a framework to evaluate every procedure and scenario you will encounter on test day and in practice. The 7 core dimensions of applied behavior analysis form the foundation of everything you'll do as a BCBA, and the exam will test your ability to recognize and apply each one. Applied means you target behaviors that genuinely matter to the client's daily life, not just convenient or trivial actions. Behavioral insists you focus on observable, measurable events, like raising a hand or completing a task, rather than internal states like feeling frustrated. Analytic requires you to demonstrate experimental control, showing that your intervention caused the behavior change. Technological means your procedures are so clearly described that another practitioner could replicate them exactly. Conceptually systematic demands that your interventions align with and are derived from behavior analytic principles, not unrelated strategies. Finally, effective ensures the change is both statistically significant and socially valuable to the client and family. On the exam, expect scenario-based questions where you must identify which dimension is being applied or violated, so practice linking each term to a concrete example. Let's take a close look at the exam structure, because understanding this breakdown is essential for your study strategy. The BCBA exam consists of 185 total questions, but only 175 of those count toward your score. The other 10 are unscored pilot items being tested for future exams, so don't let them throw you off. These 175 scored questions are drawn from a test content outline that organizes 104 specific tasks across 9 domains, each representing a core area of entry-level BCBA competence. Notably, Domain B, Concepts and Principles, carries the heaviest weight on the exam, with 24 questions making up 14% of the total. That means nearly 1 in every 7 scored questions will test your grasp of foundational behavior analytic concepts, from reinforcement schedules to stimulus control. This domain is not just a review topic, it's the bedrock of everything else you'll apply in practice. Prioritizing Domain B in your studies will pay off directly on exam day, as mastery here supports your performance across all other domains. On this slide, we're distinguishing applied behavior analysis from basic research, a distinction you'll need for the BCBA exam. Applied research tackles socially significant human problems in natural settings like classrooms or homes, directly improving client outcomes. For example, asking whether DRA reduces aggression in a classroom is applied because it targets a real-world behavior change. Basic research, in contrast, explores fundamental principles under controlled lab conditions, often using non-human subjects like rats on variable ratio schedules. While basic findings inform applied work, they aren't immediately implemented. For the exam, remember that applied research prioritizes social validity and immediate applicability, while basic research builds the scientific foundation. You'll see questions testing whether an intervention is applied, look for real-world settings, human participants, and a focus on meaningful behavior change. This distinction also ties to the dimension of applied from Baer, Wolf, and Risley, emphasizing that ABA must address behaviors that matter to clients and their communities. To fully understand applied behavior analysis, you must recognize it as one of 4 interconnected branches. First, behaviorism is the philosophical foundation, asserting that behavior is a product of environmental interactions, not internal mental causes, a core assumption tested on the exam. Next, the experimental analysis of behavior is the basic research wing, where principles like reinforcement are discovered and refined, often with non-human subjects in controlled labs. Applied behavior analysis then takes those principles and applies them to human behavior in natural settings to solve socially significant problems. This is the heart of your practice. Finally, professional practice is the delivery of evidence-based interventions to consumers, guided by behaviorism and research from both EAB and ABA. For the BCBA exam, you must differentiate these branches. Know that behaviorism provides the why, EAB provides the how it works, ABA provides the how to apply it, and professional practice is the ethical, client-focused implementation. This slide maps the journey from philosophy to practice in behavior analysis, a flow you must internalize for the BCBA exam. It begins with behaviorism, the philosophical foundation asserting that behavior is shaped by environmental interactions, not internal mental states, a core assumption that underpins everything we do. From there, the experimental analysis of behavior, EAB, discovers fundamental principles through controlled laboratory research, often with non-human subjects, establishing the basic science. Applied behavior analysis then tests these principles on humans in natural settings to solve real-world problems, translating research into actionable interventions. Finally, professional service delivery puts these validated techniques into practice with consumers, guided by both EAB and ABA. On the exam, expect questions that test your understanding of how these layers connect, for instance, how a principle discovered in the lab, like reinforcement, is applied ethically in a classroom or clinic. This flow ensures your interventions are scientifically grounded, not just intuitive. The applied dimension of ABA ensures that our work is not just scientifically sound but genuinely meaningful for the people we serve. As the slide highlights, this begins with social significance. We must target behaviors that truly matter to the client's daily life and long-term functioning, not just behaviors that are convenient to measure. This ties directly to client-centered goals, where we prioritize skills that enhance independence, community inclusion, and overall quality of life. For the BCBA exam, remember that meaningful outcomes are defined by the client, family, and community stakeholders. If they don't value the change, it isn't truly applied. Real-world relevance is critical. Interventions must address behaviors in natural settings like home, school, or work. Finally, the immediate impact means changes should be observable and beneficial in everyday environments, not just in contrived clinic settings. On the exam, you'll need to identify whether a goal or intervention meets these applied criteria, distinguishing it from purely experimental or analog work. On this slide, we're contrasting two critical dimensions, technological and conceptually systematic. A technological intervention means procedures are described so clearly and completely that another trained professional can replicate them exactly. The key question here is, can someone else implement this from the write-up? A violation would be saying, use reinforcement, without specifying what behavior, what reinforcer, or when. On the exam, you'll see scenarios where a new BCBA cannot replicate an intervention due to vague descriptions. That's a failure of the technological dimension. In contrast, conceptually systematic means the intervention must be grounded in and consistent with the principles of behavior analysis. The question becomes, does this align with basic behavioral principles? A violation would be using cognitive therapy or punishment without referencing behavioral rationale. On the exam, watch for interventions that lack behavioral justification. Those fail the conceptually systematic dimension. Both are essential for ethical, effective practice. The BCBA exam dedicates approximately 5% of its questions to Domain A, which covers behaviorism and philosophical foundations, and within that domain, you can expect about 8 questions specifically testing your understanding of the 7 dimensions of applied behavior analysis. These dimensions were originally established by Baer, Wolf, and Risley in their foundational 1968 article, and they remain a core philosophical framework for the field. It is critical to recognize that these 7 dimensions are not just historical concepts, they apply across all task content outline, TCO, areas, including assessment, intervention, and supervision. On the exam, you may be asked to identify which dimension is being demonstrated in a given scenario or to select the dimension that a particular practice is lacking. For example, a question might describe an intervention that is not generalizing to new settings, which would relate to the dimension of generality. Mastery of these dimensions helps you evaluate whether a behavior analytic approach is truly applied, effective, and conceptually systematic, which is essential for both the exam and ethical practice. Now, let's focus on 3 core dimensions that guide how we design interventions: behavioral, analytic, and effective. The behavioral dimension requires that target behaviors be directly observable and measurable using standard dimensions like rate or duration, so we avoid hypothetical constructs such as feeling motivated. This is why operational definitions are essential. They ensure everyone can agree on exactly what behavior we're addressing. The analytic dimension demands that we demonstrate a functional relation between the intervention and behavior change, typically through single-case designs that show experimental control, replicate effects across conditions or participants, and rule out alternative explanations. On the BCBA exam, you'll need to identify how these designs prove that your intervention, not something else, caused the change. Finally, the effective dimension means behavior change must be clinically meaningful. Statistical significance alone isn't enough. Stakeholders must value the magnitude of change, and effectiveness is judged by real-world impact, not just data in a graph. Generality is a cornerstone dimension of applied behavior analysis, and on the BCBA exam, you must understand that it refers to behavior change that lasts, appears in new settings, and spreads across related behaviors and people. This slide outlines that true generality means the learner uses the skill at home, school, or in the community, not just where training occurred, and that the behavior maintains over time after the intervention is faded. It also highlights response generalization, where teaching one behavior may lead to untrained changes in similar behaviors, and stimulus generalization across different people, so the learner responds to anyone, not just the original therapist. For the exam, remember that programming for generality is proactive. You must use multiple exemplars, build natural contingencies into the environment, and incorporate loose training to ensure the behavior transfers. A common test item will ask you to identify which strategy promotes generalization or to recognize a scenario where generality has failed, so focus on how these tactics connect to lasting, meaningful behavior change. This slide clarifies a critical distinction you'll need for the BCBA exam. Behaviorism is the philosophical foundation, while applied behavior analysis is the practical application. Behaviorism asks why behavior happens, focusing on environmental contingencies rather than internal causes like anger. In contrast, ABA takes those principles and uses them to design interventions that solve real-world, socially significant problems. For example, a behaviorist might explain that tantrums are maintained by reinforcement in the environment. A BCBA would implement a DRA intervention to reduce tantrums and teach a replacement communication skill. On the exam, you may be tested on this difference, perhaps in questions about the philosophical assumptions of behaviorism versus the dimensions of ABA, especially the applied dimension. Remember, as a practitioner, your role is not just to theorize but to deliver evidence-based services that produce meaningful behavior change for clients. This distinction underpins everything you do as a BCBA. To truly master the BCBA exam, you must understand that the 7 dimensions are not isolated checkboxes but an interdependent framework. This slide emphasizes that in practice, every dimension must work in concert. For example, when you select a socially significant behavior, applied, you immediately ensure it is observable and measurable, behavioral. When you design an intervention, you must not only demonstrate experimental control, analytic, but also confirm the behavior change is meaningful to the client and stakeholders, effective. Your procedures must be so clearly written, technological, that another practitioner can replicate them, while remaining grounded in behavioral principles, conceptually systematic. Crucially, you must plan for maintenance and generalization from the very start, generality, not as an afterthought. On the exam, expect scenario-based questions where you must identify if a dimension is missing, for instance, a plan that shows behavior change but fails to program for generalization. Remember, Client-centered integration means all dimensions align to improve quality of life, which is the ultimate goal of our science. As we close this module, remember that the 7 dimensions of applied behavior analysis, applied, behavioral, analytic, technological, conceptually systematic, effective, and generality, are not just a list to memorize for the exam, they are the framework that ensures our interventions are meaningful, measurable, and lasting. You've seen how applied research targets socially significant behaviors, while basic research builds the scientific foundation, and how the 4 branches of behavior analysis flow from philosophy to practical application. For the BCBA exam, expect questions that test your ability to distinguish these dimensions, especially applied, technological, and conceptually systematic, and to recognize how they integrate into real-world intervention design. Generality, in particular, is a high-yield concept. Lasting behavior change is the ultimate goal. As you prepare, think of each dimension as a lens through which you evaluate every procedure. You are not just learning facts, you are building a professional identity. Now, go make that change stick. Your clients and your exam success depend on it.